In 1966, an injustice that was so egregious occurred. It was an injustice that captured really the country. It was an injustice that created a movie that the consummate actor Denzel Washington starred in, was nominated for an Academy Award for his portrayal of this person. It was an injustice so great that no lesser light than Bob Dylan wrote an almost 9-minute song telling the story of the injustice. Curtis Ramsey Lucas suggested that song be sung this morning by someone, and I said, but if we do, there won't be time for a sermon and people will be crushed. And so we had to postpone that. Maybe Curtis will sing it for you in the lobby or something. The person that all that was done about was a middleweight boxer of some success by the name of Reuben Carter. He hit so fast and so furious, he got the nickname Hurricane. So they called him Reuben Hurricane Carter. On June 17th, 1966, the Lafayette Bar and Grill in Paterson, New Jersey was robbed, and in the process, 3 people were killed. Reuben Hurricane Carter and 2 friends were just passing by in a big white car. The police stopped them, but then after talking to them, let them go, said there was nothing connecting to them to the crime. But not long after that, 2 people who were actually implicated in the crime said they colluded in their testimonies and said it was Reuben Hurricane Carter that came in. In fact, it was one of them that came in, but they pinned it on Reuben Hurricane Carter. He was convicted and put in the East Jersey State Penitentiary, where he stayed for almost 20 years. Now, the first 10 years of his life, he was furious. He was so angry. Most of that time was spent in solitary confinement because he kept disrupting everything in his rage at what had been done to him. But he said that somewhere toward the end of those 10 years, something he never expected to happen in prison occurred. He met Jesus Christ. He met God. And through his prayer and conversation with God, a miracle occurred. And he wrote about it in his biography called The 16th Round. And he said, if I've learned anything in my life, bitterness consumes the vessel that contains it. Bitterness consumes the vessel that contains it. And he let it go. After nearly 20 years of false imprisonment, he was exonerated through DNA evidence and he was released. He told his story often and helped other prisoners who he felt were unjustly convicted, but he never exhibited any more bitterness in his life. Some things happen to us and we just sort of shake them off, right? An insult, an offense, somebody's thoughtless word or deed, and you know, we kind of take it. The jab grazes our chin, but it doesn't land. And we can sort of forget about it after time. The grace of God comes in and it just doesn't bother us. It dampens our mood for a while, but then it sort of dissipates. But then there are other things that hurt too much, that go on too long, that stay with us and make us bitter. The roots go down inside us. They spread out and begin to affect us on many levels. That's what we're going to talk about today. Bitterness. Bitterness. Now, some people like the taste of bitter things. I bet you like something that's bitter. Coffee. Any of you drink coffee here? That's a bitter taste. Unsweetened chocolate. You ever put any of that? You know, like baker's chocolate. You get something in your mouth and goes, that's not a Hershey bar. And you go, ooh, that's kind of bitter. A lot of teas are bitter. Down in New Orleans, they like Chicory's very bitter. Ginger, almost all roots are a little bit bitter. A lot of spices are bitter. Almost all alcohol is bitter. That's why people put sodas and juice and stuff trying to sweeten it up a little bit. Brussels sprouts, don't you? I mean, that's listed in the list of bitter things, and I would truly agree with that. Some people really like the taste of bitter, but nobody likes bitter experiences, do they? Nobody likes bitter experiences. They leave a bad taste in our mouths, pardon the pun. And what happens if we don't tend to the bitterness is it gets deeper and it gets wider. And after a while, we're not just bitter about an event or a toxic relationship or some misfortunate event. We just become characterized by bitterness. We just seem to be mad at the world. And that's where Hannah found herself, the central character of our story this morning. Her life started off pretty well. Bitterness usually arises in us when we feel like something unfair has happened to us. Somebody has treated us unfairly, either a person or an institution. Some people get bitter at fate or fortune or God. It just feels like this shouldn't have happened to me. You ever felt that way? I think most of us do. And a lot of people feel like there's a series of things, like life just keeps throwing them curves and they can't catch their breath. It's just a negative sort of thing. And that's where Hannah found herself. Her life didn't start out that way. She married well. She married a guy named Elkanah, and what we know about Elkanah is he had some cash. Don't we usually like to marry people who have a little cash? I know Karen was thrilled when I found out I owed everybody on the planet when we got married. You like a little cash, in the person you're going to spend your life with. He also came from a good family all the way back. I mean, several generations. They were good folk. And the third thing they had going for them is that they actually loved each other. Remember, this is a time in culture when most marriages were arranged, and you kind of learn to love each other maybe, or make the best of it. You try to get through life. But in this case, something really unusual happened. They actually loved each other. And she had that great affection for Elkanah, and he had that great affection for her. But then one thing went wrong. They both wanted children. And they couldn't have them. They didn't conceive. They tried repeatedly, but they didn't conceive any children. And that made Hannah bitter. She was bitter at God. Why is God doing this? She thought everything that happens God does, and so if I'm not having children, it must be God. Why would God do this to me? And then her bitterness intensified. For Elkanah, in his despair and desperation to have a child, took a second wife, a younger woman. That hardly ever happens anymore, but a younger woman, Peninnah was her name. And this was not a marriage of love. It was a marriage of expediency. It says very clearly he didn't love her, but he thought she might be able to produce a child. And she did. She produced several children. Now the whole neighborhood, the whole village, in Hannah's view, knew it wasn't that God was punishing Elkanah. Now he's got children. It was that God had it out for her. That's unfair. Why me? Hannah thought. Why me? How come I can't have a child? Elkanah does. Peninnah does. And then it got worse. Peninnah, evidently sensing that Elkanah loved Hannah more than he would ever love her, and noticing that Hannah was still very distraught over her inability to produce a child, she started taunting her. The Bible says she taunted her publicly, privately, repeatedly, insufferably. Everywhere they went, she taunted her. She made fun of her. She humiliated her. And her bitterness just engulfed her. Hannah's bitterness just engulfed her. And when we meet her in the story, she has quit eating. She won't eat a thing, and she can't stop crying. And we wonder, what's going to happen? Will this bitterness destroy the container that carries it. In the height of her desperation, she prays. She prays to God, and she makes a strange bargain. The Bible says she prays through bitter tears. Through bitter tears, she calls out to God, and she says, if you will give me a child and shut Penina's mouth, I will dedicate this child to you. The child can serve the priest and live in the temple. Doesn't even have to reside with me. I'll bring him to the temple. Just give me a child. Now, this is Mother's Day. And it's the day that we hope all the children tell their mother that you mean a lot to us. I want to tell my mother that. I will talk with her later. She's been a wonderful mother I am grateful for. I'm grateful to have her around at her age. She wouldn't want me to tell you her age. But I'm grateful for mothers, and I'm grateful for mine. I hope mothers also are grateful to have children. I hope you are. That, it hadn't been a rose garden. Can we get an amen to that? Some ups and downs, but that you are grateful to have been a mother. And most mothers that I know are rather appalled at Hannah's prayer because she's given away the kid in the best years of having a kid, in the childhood years. Remember, where kids they're nice back in then. Years ago, Karen and I were eating at Chi-Chi's, and she was with child. Karen was visibly pregnant. And the waitress at Chi-Chi's, she served us our meal, and she said, oh, you're going to have a baby. And Karen said, yes. And she said, oh, babies are wonderful. Oh, children are wonderful. But when they become teenagers, she said, oh, it's horrible. And the woman literally sat down at our table and went on for 20 minutes about how horrible her teenage children were. So if Hannah would have told God at the age of 15, I'll bring this boy to the temple, we'd all understood that, right? Oh, yeah, let's see if we can all get that deal. But instead, she says, in the innocent years, in the playful years, in the formative years, when children are a lot of fun, she says, I'm going to bring that child. I won't even be around that child if you just give me this child. And in such a desperate prayer, we wonder what she's going to do next. If this prayer is not granted, what will she do next? She's not the only bitter mother in the Bible. The most famous, I think, bitter mother in the Bible is Naomi, who felt her life had turned horribly unfortunate. And she had to leave her country in a famine and then had to witness the death of her husband and two of her sons. And after that, she told her daughter-in-laws, Ruth and Orpah, don't call me Naomi anymore. That name means pleasant. Nothing about my life is pleasant. Call me Mara, which means bitter, because I am bitter, for the Lord has dealt bitterly with me. Now, if we can see a link between our own behavior and the stuff that happens to us, we can kind of understand that, right? We say, well, I kind of brought this on myself, the way I acted or the choices I made. That's not where bitterness comes from. In fact, in this story, Hannah prays this prayer of desperation and bitterness so passionately, her lips begin to move, but she's not making any sound. And Eli, the priest, says to her, you're drunk, woman. Why would you get drunk and come to church? I've known some pastors who did that, but I don't think it's good. Well, why did you get drunk and come to church? And read what Hannah says. She says, Lord, I'm not an unworthy woman. I'm a misfortunate woman. You see the difference? I'm not drunk. I'm not a sinful creature. I'm an unlucky creature. Naomi says the very same thing to her daughter-in-laws. My life is now permeated by misfortune. And that's where bitterness comes from. It comes from this feeling like I've been mistreated. Life has not been fair. God has not been good to me, and my life is a wreck, and it's not my fault, and I'm bitter. Bitter. But it's understandable, but it's very destructive, and I do not recommend you harbor bitterness. It's strange how in many ways we cling to bitterness more fiercely than any other emotion. We won't let it go. And yet it is destroying us. I have seen so much bitterness in all of my ministry. I saw a woman who was so bitter about the death of her daughter and how her daughter died that she burned down her entire house to turn every physical memory of that girl into ashes. I knew another wife that was so bitter at her husband for his infidelities and eventual abandonment, she took a hammer and nails and nailed the door to what was their bedroom shut and never entered that room again. I knew another wife that was so bitter at the abuses her husband had wreaked upon her life, she took all of his clothes, all of his favorite possessions, everything precious to him, put him in the middle of the living room and torched him. Now, she luckily calmed down enough to put the fire out before it burned down her whole house, but she set him on fire in the middle of her home. I knew a man who was so bitter at the company that fired him from a high-paying job that he became lost in alcohol the rest of his life. He died driving a riding lawnmower to a liquor store on a state highway because he'd lost his license to drive everything else. And when he was on that riding lawnmower, he couldn't get out of the way of a semi, and he died out of bitterness. Bitterness. I've known siblings that lost the last 20 years of Christmases with their mother because they were so bitter towards each other they refused to sit in the same room with each other. I knew a preacher's daughter who was so bitter at the church for the way they treated her father that at his funeral, she stood up and cursed the whole lot of them. Bitterness. Bitterness. I have an ancestor in my own family who was so bitter with her daughter for reasons that none of us could understand that she left directions in her last will and testament that she was to be buried facing a different direction than every other grave in the cemetery so she wouldn't have to look at her daughter through all eternity. And I could fill an auditorium with people who have told me over the years that they're so bitter at God for some loss or misfortune that they will never enter a church again. But I ask you, who is that bitterness hurting? Who is that bitterness hurting? It's not hurting the target. It's hurting the perpetrator. We got to learn how to give up bitterness, get it changed before it destroys us. This is the third sermon in a sermon series that I've titled Spiritual Alchemy. Spiritual alchemy is this old pseudoscience where people pretended they could turn common metals like lead into precious metals like gold. They never could do it, but they pretended to do it. I'm using that as a metaphor to talk about how God can take negative experiences, negative emotions in our life, and transform them through God's grace and power into very precious things in our lives, positive things in our lives. We've talked about God's ability to transform sorrow into joy, for instance. And today we're looking at how God can transform bitterness into gratitude. Now, if you are one that deals with bitterness, you may be thinking that's impossible. You don't know what's happened to me. You don't know how life has treated me. Well, I'm just trying to say you're not hurting the people you want to hurt. Reuben Hurricane Carter was right. You're just hurting yourself. How does God transform bitterness into gratitude? By giving us a redeemed perspective. I want to say that again. God does it by giving us a redeemed perspective on life. We see it in Hannah. We see it in the passages that Cheryl read, because after Hannah prayed this prayer of desperation, pretty soon she's with child. And then she gives birth to a child. And when she does, she goes to God, and let me read it again. She says, "My heart rejoices in the Lord. I delight in my God. I am thankful for my deliverance," she says. And then she says, "There is no God like our God. Our God is a rock," she says. Whoa, what a transformation from a woman who's bitter at God to one that says, God is the rock of my life. That's transformed by a renewed perspective. Naomi got it too. When they put Obed into her hands, her grandson into her hands, she and the village women all cried out, praise be to God. And she reclaimed her name, Naomi. We too can be transformed from bitterness into gratitude if we let God give us a redeemed perspective, to look at things a little differently. James Hillman, he's a great psychologist of a former era and a spiritual leader, he says that every adult over 40 ought to write a life review every 5 years. A life review. Now, let me explain that. That's not what a lot of precious and generous older adults do when they write down their life story and they tell you about their childhood. My mother did this once and it was a great gift to us all, just learning about childhood and adolescence and the way the world was. That's a wonderful gift, but that's not a life review. Hillman said a life review is only for your eyes. You don't show it to anybody else ever. And you write down, it doesn't have to be in chronological order. It doesn't have to start at your birth. It can start anywhere. He says, just write down the significant events that come into your mind when you review your life. Some of them will be negative. Some of them will be heartaches. Some of them will be joys and benefits. We'll have them all there. And he says, write them down. And then 5 years later, take it and look at it and update it. And he says, a wonderful thing God does over time, that God begins to filter stuff out. And one of the ways that God does it is through the blessing of forgetfulness. How many of you are a little more forgetful than you are today? Yeah, and we don't like that, right? Oh, where are my glasses, and where's this, and I can't remember this person's name, and it goes on. Hillman says, thank God every time that happens. God's sort of washing your brain. Let me read to you. He says, what happens when you start looking at that is warmth finds its way into the cold storage vaults of the mind. Isn't that a wonderful phrase? Warmth finds its way into the cold storage vaults of the mind. Arduous struggles, envious rivalries, even betrayals come back with a different effect. They don't hurt as much over the years. The musing we do about them might even make some of them amusing. The long illness, the wrong marriage, all the slings and arrows of outrage lose their fire and forget their aim. Why does this happen? Hillman says, because as we age, I love this, the soul begins to let go of the weights it has been carrying in preparation for its final ascent. Isn't that beautiful? Isn't that beautiful? All that stuff we harbor, all that stuff we grind on, all those grudges we nurse. That God's grace comes with this redeemed perspective, and as we look back at our life, we begin to see that the mind of spirit and grace of God is releasing these things one by one to get the soul light and ready and prepared for our final ascent to be with God. He says God's grace of forgiveness begins to coat even our worst experiences, so that there is less remembered and therefore less to be bitter about. The grace of God. The late, great John Prine put it this way. He said, there are all these things that I don't think I remember. How lucky can one man get? There are all these things that after a while we just don't remember. Those pains that we thought we could never turn loose of. God's grace does it. And then finally, there's another miracle. We start getting this perspective as it sort of filters out and lightens up the soul. And then we begin to see our life differently. We quit seeing it as a series of fortunate and unfortunate events, blessings and curses, dreams that are broken and dreams that come true. We quit seeing it as a necklace with little beads, and we begin to see the grand theme of our life. We begin to see, yeah, all these things happened, and they went, it's more like a musical masterpiece, to tie into Pastor Mark today. It's more like a musical masterpiece where some of it might be dissonant and cacophonous and not make a lot of sense. But then there's these other places that it just soars as our life. It just soars by God's grace. And as we look at it, we begin to see the theme is not bitterness. The theme, the river that runs through it, is the goodness of God. And bitterness becomes gratitude to what God has done for us. Healthy mothers have this capacity. They sit down with you. I know my mother did over and over. They sit down with you and say, this bad thing that happened to you, it's a bad thing. You shouldn't lie. It's a bad thing. But it doesn't define you. Your life's bigger than this. God's grace will be with you. You'll recover from this broken heart. You'll recover from this school you never got into. You'll recover from this bad job. You'll recover because of the goodness of God. What a wonderful gift that healthy mothers give us. At the end of his life, Reuben Hurricane Carter was interviewed. And here's what he said. If I had an opportunity to change anything at all in my life, I would not do it. I love the person I am today. The person who went to prison and the person who came out of prison are two different people. God's grace was always at work, transforming my bitterness, making me a better man. God's always at work in your life and in my life, transforming our bitterness into gratitude. Thanks be to God.